Dianne Augat was born on February 21st, 1958. As a child, she relocated with her family from the state of New York to the sunny skies of Florida, where, as an adult, she would meet and marry her husband Frederick Augat in the late 70s. She lived well with her husband and was able to be a stay-at-home mom for her 3 children. But in the late 80s, Dianne began to exhibit some rather bizarre and irrational behavior. According to friends and family, eventually at the urging of her social group, she began to seek professional help from a therapist, where she was diagnosed with what was known at the time as manic depressive disorder. She was given medication to help control it, and she seemed to do far better. After some time, however, for various reasons, she began to ease herself off of her medication and refuse all treatment for her condition. As people noticed, her behavior once again began to shift into the bizarre and irrational. In 1988, the state brought charges of child abuse against Dianne, claiming that she had been inventing ailments for her children and seeking a substantial amount of assistance for them, what is known as Munchausen by proxy. While Dianne was ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing, the State Department continued to pursue the issue, believing her to have committed these crimes, even going as far as to remove her children from her home. In 1991, after a long and turbulent road had been traversed, Dianne and Frederick divorced. As if going through her divorce weren't hard enough for her, she hit rock bottom when the court awarded full custody of their children to their father. Dianne had lost everything. She went into a depression and spiraled downhill for the next several years. Her friends and family noted that she ended up constantly having conversations with herself, and that she had developed a tendency to simply hang out with anybody who was nice to her at some point. But sometimes it was as though a switch had flipped inside of her, and she would become quickly angry, getting into somebody's face, and be entirely out of control. She had developed a drinking and substance abuse problem, which worsened her already present issues. These problems led her to be arrested and printed several times, as well as being involuntarily committed to mental health facilities over 32 times. When she had last been released from the mental health facility, her family insisted that she move in with her sister in Hudson, owing to the fact that she had had so many episodes with her illness. At least for the time being, they wanted her to move in with her sister so that someone could be there if she should need help. On the morning of April 10th, 1998, Dianne's sister had a doctor's appointment, and she left Dianne at home while she went to keep it. When she returned, Dianne was nowhere to be seen. The neighbors told her that she had taken a walk around 11 a.m., but nobody had seen her return. Dianne wouldn't return that night. It wasn't unheard of that she would disappear for a day or two, but she always came back home. This time, however, was different. She had been in a downward spiral, and her family was worried about her. The following morning, April 11th, her family filed a missing persons report. Because of the nature of her mental state at the time of her disappearance, the police took the report and set to work trying to find her. The first person of any help to talk to them was a bartender at the Hayloft Tavern, who told police that he had cut her off after she'd had a few drinks and began acting strangely, walking in circles for no apparent reason. This was the last sighting of her thus far. She didn't have her medication. Who knew where she was or what had happened to her? And it would be several days before another clue as to what had happened to her would surface. It would arrive on April 15th. On that day, Dianne's mother's phone began to ring. On her caller ID was simply the name Starlight. When she answered the phone, she heard her daughter's voice asking for help. This jarred her mother, but what scared her even more was what happened next. A male voice yelled at her, snatched the phone away, and hung up. She called the number back several times that day and for several days following the call, but to no effect. Nobody ever answered, not even an answering machine. She had no clues as to where the call had originated, and neither did the police, for that matter. The only business anywhere nearby with the name Starlight in the title was a strip club, and there was no record of police finding anything there. But this did raise the intensity of the investigation. She was quite possibly in danger and needed to be found quickly. Somebody likely had her. On the same day that the call had come to Dianne's mother, something else happened that rocked the family. About 4 p.m., a woman was walking along Route 19 on her way to work as usual, when she noticed a prop finger on the side of the highway, probably from a play. She left it where it was and went to work, but she would later recount the finding to her boyfriend. Something about that finger and the way she described it nagged at him all night. The following morning, he would go have a look for himself. When he stumbled upon it, he realized it was not a prop finger from a play, as his girlfriend had thought, but it was an actual human finger, taken from an actual human hand. It even had red nail polish on it. He called the police, who arrived at the scene very quickly. To try to identify who was missing a finger, the first thing they did was to print it. Luckily, whatever had happened had occurred recently enough that the fingerprints had not decayed. But they were in for a surprise when the printing came back. There was a match. The finger belonged to Dianne Augat. Since she had been arrested several times prior to this, her fingerprints were on record. But how had her finger come to be severed on Route 19? Police theorized it had been slammed in a car door, but that didn't pan out. It was likely that it had been taken purposely, possibly as punishment for calling her mother. The police now had little doubt that Dianne had not disappeared on her own. When she was off her medication, Dianne had a tendency to become a little too trusting of people. Perhaps this had led her into a bad situation. The police organized a land and helicopter search of the area where the finger had been found. Every inch of the surrounding area was searched, as well as places far and wide that she was known to frequent, but not a single clue was found. Tips continued to pour in, and they were all investigated, but nothing panned out. On April 18th, 1 week after the missing persons report was filed, Dianne's story made the news. Her photograph was shown, her description was given, and the public was asked for their help in finding the missing woman. The police officially stated that they did not believe that Dianne left of her own free will. She didn't even have a car. She likely trusted the wrong person and took a ride from them. On the same day that the story broke on the local news, a chilling discovery was made 25 miles north of Tampa. At a convenience store that Dianne frequented, the manager, Patricia Splendorio, made a check of the outdoor freezer units which were used to store ice. When she opened the door, she found a pile of neatly folded clothing sitting on the merchandise. It was confusing at first, but when she took a closer look, it became frightening. She recognized the clothing as belonging to Dianne. She had frequented the store, and the manager recognized the clothing she favorited. It was impossible to tell when the items had been placed into the unit. It had not been checked for 3 weeks prior to the discovery. The convenience store had no security cameras pointed at the units, so there was no way to tell who had done this. It might have been Dianne herself, for all they knew. The family also identified it as Dianne's clothing. But who had put it there? Well, the police had a suspicion. Dianne had begun to hang out with a group of people in the recent past that some referred to as the juveniles. She had become so trusting that she allowed these people to hang out at her house while she was gone. According to witnesses, they would throw wild parties and loot at her home, even carrying out larger items without her consent. Given the witness descriptions of these people and their behavior, the police had a strong suspicion that these were the people who had placed her clothing inside of the freezer at the store. But in the end, it would be impossible to positively say who had done it. It became a frustrating part of the investigation, knowing that it was urgent that they find her, yet also knowing someone nearby seemed to be toying with them. First a finger, then her clothing. What next? They continued working the case, and tips kept coming in. It seemed as though all people all over the area had seen a woman matching her description. All leads were followed up. One particular witness came forward, claiming to have seen her walking along New York Avenue between 3 and 4 in the morning on April 11th. That was 1 day after the last known sighting of her, occurring, in fact, on the same day that the police report was filed. It was also the same area where her finger was discovered. Another witness claimed to have sighted her on the same day that the ominous phone call was made to her mother, though the story was uncorroborated. None of the tips, however, panned out. Dianne was not located, and the tips eventually slowed to a trickle. The only thing they had was a single finger and a neatly folded pile of clothing. Then, in November of 2000, an article was published wherein the family spoke about Dianne, what made her life spiral, her alcoholism, her loss of her family, and her disappearance. The police would state that the case was still ongoing. The following day, on November 25th, a chilling discovery was made. Dianne's brother's girlfriend made a routine trip to the Circle K convenience store to buy a lottery ticket. On top of the counter, she discovered a bag someone had left, until she saw what was written on it. It was a single word: Dianne. She picked up the bag and took it with her on the off chance that this may have something to do with Dianne Augat's case. You never knew. Her clothes had been discovered in an odd place. Why not this bag? And her suspicion turned out to likely be correct. The bag included many items that she was known to have carried at the time of her disappearance. The same perfume, lipstick, etc. What was of particular note was the bag itself, which was the same type of bag that had been issued by the mental health facility from which she had been discharged. Also inside the bag was the same generic toothpaste which had also been distributed to the patients of the facility. For her family, there was no doubt this bag belonged to Dianne. They could understand someone coming from the facility with a few of the brands that Dianne liked, but all of them? Every single item she was known to have carried with her in her purse, every one of them, was there. It was simply too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. Somebody in the area knew something. Police announced that they would be reviewing the convenience store tape in order to determine who had placed the bag there, but it seems that nothing ever came of that. On Wednesday, June 27, 2001, at 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 men with ski masks pulled over their faces burst into the Coral Sands Motel in Hudson, Florida. They were carrying firearms. They proceeded to hit Rose Casper in the face with their weapons. She yelled for her boyfriend, Gary Evers, who was the co-manager, and he came running. By the time he had arrived, Rose had been struck in the face multiple times. The intruders saw Gary coming and fled the scene. He was unable to catch up to them. The following evening, Evers invited Todd Cammers into his office at the motel and invited him to sit down. Cammers had a long record of criminal activity, including several break-ins, which is likely why Evers would take a seat across from him and point a pistol in his face. He asked one question: "Did you attack my girlfriend last night?" Presumably he said no, but it hardly matters to Evers, who emptied 2 full magazines into him anyway. Evers was arrested, and it was revealed later at the trial that Cammers, in fact, had not been guilty of the attack. In fact, he had only showed up to meet with Evers in order to clear his name. What does this have to do with Dianne Augat? Well, it turns out that one of the last places that Dianne was known to have been seen was Evers' motel, the Coral Sands. Is it possible that one person who was off of her medication had a run-in with a man who had a temper of this nature and met with foul play? As it turns out, Evers was a suspect in her case. But why would he keep dropping off items belonging to her in different places in broad daylight? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Was it just blind luck that he'd never been seen doing this? Or was it a different person entirely? He took the answers with him to the grave and died in prison in 2012. Unfortunately, the case has gone cold over the last 20 years. Dianne remains missing.